Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Private Finance Sustainability 5 in 5. I'm Tom Cascales from the Climate and ESG Capital Market team here at NatWest, and this month I'm joined by Alistair Perkins. We will be talking about the Net Zero Investment Framework for Infrastructure. Alistair is the head of infrastructure debt at NN Investment Partner, which is now part of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, and also the co-lead of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change Infrastructure Working Group. Welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that kind introduction.
So let's jump right in. Alistair, as the co-lead of IGCC's Infrastructure Group, could you tell us more about the mandate for the group?
Yes, sure. The working group for IGCC was set up in 2020, basically to expand the scope of IGCC's net zero investment framework by including infrastructure as an additional asset class. So the mandate of the working group was simply to draft the infrastructure components, which required defining firstly the scope of the asset class, as well as assessing existing methodologies and approaches to net zero alignment for infrastructure assets. So the group considered many of the barriers and limitations for investors and also proposed a number of practical solutions to apply the net zero framework, whilst also ensuring that the approach for infrastructure assets remained as closely aligned as possible with other IIGC's net zero investment framework for other asset classes.
And I noticed that you recently published a consultation document on proposed component for infrastructure for the Net Zero Investment Framework. Could you describe this in little more detail?
Yes, the Infra Working Group recently produced a public consultation document in July 2022, which set out the infrastructure components and recommendations on methodologies. So the proposed infrastructure components include, firstly, a broad definition of infrastructure assets, whilst also providing a clear boundary relative to other asset classes. It also listed 6 criteria for assessing the alignment of operational infrastructure assets, and also to set out some further criteria for greenfield assets in the construction phase. It also then proposed specific target setting approach for infrastructure assets to be set by investors to enable them to be considered as net zero aligned investors. And lastly, it included a list of recommended actions that investors could apply at different stages of the investment cycle to increase their proportion of aligned assets.
And what was the most prominent feedback you received during the consultation period?
Well, overall, the feedback to the consultation process and the components for infrastructure was very positive. There were requests for some clarifications on certain alignment criteria and actions, and some respondents also highlighted the challenges regarding lack of data and science-based pathways, particularly in emerging markets. The working group is also currently discussing this feedback and assessing where changes or clarifications may be helpful in the final document.
Thank you. That's very useful. With regard to the proposed metrics for measuring net zero alignments, in the document, 2 science-based approaches and 1 carbon budget approach are presented. Could you explain the difference between these 2?
Sure. I think the first thing to mention and to clarify here is that a carbon budget is also a science-based approach, and so the perceived difference is actually quite limited. That said, I consider that many of the science-based targets, such as SBTI, for example, are provided by reference to specific sectors, such as transportation, whereas a carbon budget may be applied across a whole infrastructure portfolio, which itself may include assets in different subsectors. Also, another difference of approaches may be used to assess net zero alignment at different stages of an infrastructure asset's life cycle, for example, during the construction phase versus the operational phase. And lastly, I think it's worth emphasizing the important contribution that infrastructure assets can actually make in delivering climate solutions targets, such as decarbonization of energy, decarbonization of transportation, and decarbonisation of heat, meaning industrial and domestic heating and cooling systems.
We know that the field is still evolving, so how can someone listening to this podcast support the initiative?
Yes, for investors, the best way I think for them to support is to set up and disclose their own net zero commitments. For investors which already have net zero commitments, they can also support the initiative by adding their infrastructure assets within their commitment using IGCC's methodology. And lastly, for outside observers, they can also support the initiative by engaging with investors and asset owners to encourage them to further strengthen their own net zero commitments.
Great, thank you, Alistair, and thank you to our listener. As always, please be sure to check out our monthly newsletter, link in the description, for more on the key sustainability trends shaping the market. Thanks again, and see you next time.